Okay, everyone, we'll get this tutorial started. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dominik Straub at the Center for Cognitive Science in TU Darmstadt. And he will lead us through a series of code exercises and other interesting material to help us get a handle on some of the techniques we heard about earlier. So Dominik, thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much for the introduction, and thanks to the organizers for inviting us to this tutorial. So a quick disclaimer before I get started. So if you have a background in computational modeling or motor control, a lot of the material in this tutorial is not going to be surprising to you, but I try to make this tutorial as accessible as possible for an audience with diverse backgrounds, and I hope that everyone can get something out of this. And please interrupt me at any time for questions or discussion points. So what's the plan? I'll start. The first part will be about optimal control in continuous psychophysics, and I'll start with some general thoughts and conceptual points about modeling perception and action under uncertainty. Then I'll introduce continuous psychophysics tracking tasks in a bit more detail and tell you why they are so cool as a new way of doing like psychophysical measurements. Then I'll talk about how to model them as optimal control, specifically in the linear quadratic Gaussian framework. And then I'll show you the implementation in Python, and we'll look at the influence of some of the model's parameters in a bit more detail. The second part of the tutorial will be focused on inverse optimal control. And to kind of motivate inverse optimal control, I talk about some of the problems with normative models, and then talk about why we think inverse normative modeling is the way to go. And I'll show you the derivations for inverse optimal control in this framework. And again, walk through the implementation in Python, for which we'll use the probabilistic programming framework NumPyro. And if we have time, I'll talk about some extensions to signal-dependent noise and possibly other extensions to the framework. So let's start with optimal control and continuous psychophysics. So when our goal is to understand perception and action and uncertainty, there's a spectrum of different tasks that we can think of, ranging from the classical controlled laboratory experiments in trial-based psychophysics, where you have independent trials, subjects have to make a single inference about the stimulus presented on the screen, and then make a binary decision about it, to ranging to natural behavior, where you have complex sequential tasks where people pursue multiple goals, like here, making a sandwich and having a cup of coffee at the same time. So people have to perform sequential inference in their environment and continuously act in this environment. And these, as Konstantin has told you in the keynote, in these trial-based psychophysics tasks, we can really control the probabilistic structure of the task because we know what the uncertainties involved in the task are, and we can be sure that they are really perceptual, for example, and that all of the other statistical uncertainty is controlled by the experiment because we know the observer has been trained to do the task, for example. So that means that we can come up with accurate models of these uncertainties and task goals and use the tools of normative modeling, such as signal detection theory or more generally Bayesian models, to come up with a computational level analysis or a rational analysis of the behavior in the task. So what are the assumptions of these normative models? I just repeat some of these points from the keynote. So we know that the world is uncertain, ambiguous, and noisy. You have ambiguous retinal images. You have to combine uncertain information from different sources. And you can use prior expectations to make sense of these noisy sensory signals. And what is the normative way of doing this? Well, Bayesian inference. So you assume that there's some latent state of the world X. You make some noisy observations of it, which we call Y, and then you use the probability theory to come up with a posterior distribution and make sense of the state of the world. But our actions also have consequences. We don't only want to perceive the world, but also act in it. And this is already the case for the simplest possible signal detection experiments, where you get different rewards for hits, false alarms, correct rejections, etc. And here's another example from sensory motor decision making, where you have to touch these regions on the screen with your hand, and you get different rewards or costs depending on which region you touch. And the normative way of modeling these single trial decision-making tasks is basically Bayesian decision theory, where in addition to these latent variables that describe the state of the world, you have some costs associated with it. And although I don't particularly like this notation of using J for costs and X for states, this is what people in optimal control do, so I'm going to stick with it. So the goal is to find the action that minimizes these expected costs over this latent variable. While in simple psychophysics tasks, it is possible to formalize these uncertainties and goals involved in the task, in natural behavior, this is not the case. We need to give up some of this experimental control, and we don't actually know what the uncertainties, goals, etc. are. This makes natural tasks simply too complex for normative models. So it's cool that we can do this in these simple trial-based psychophysics tasks, but as all of you who have done these tasks know, these tasks are also tedious and boring for the subjects, as already famously noted by William James, who blamed this on the Germans. So the question is, can we find something in between? Can we find a compromise where we keep some of the experimental control of the uncertainties and goals that we like in these psychophysics experiments, but move towards natural behavior by introducing a bit more complex structure in the task. So Kate Bonn and colleagues came up with this really cool new paradigm where you have sequential actions, you have sequential inferences, but you still maintain precise control about the stimulus and about the task statistics. So I explain a bit more detail how this task works. So this is a target tracking task. So you have this Gaussian blob stimulus in this noise pattern, and the goal is to track the target with a mouse cursor, or in other versions of the task with your finger or with your eyes. And the data that you get from this kind of task looks like this. So you have over time, you have the position of the target that moves on this Gaussian random walk, and then you have the position of the response, in this case the cursor, which kind of tracks the target but with some time lag. And one common way to look at these data are these cross-correlograms, where you look at the velocity of the target and the velocity of the response, and you correlate them at different time lags. And what you can see is that after some time lag, you get a maximal correlation between these velocities, and then it falls off. And if you change the perceptual uncertainty by lowering the contrast, for example, you can see that these cross-correlograms change and that their maximum correlation becomes lower and their lag increases. What this tells us is that you can estimate perceptual uncertainty with these tasks because these summary statistics of these cross-correlograms are correlated with the classical psychophysical measurements, but you can do it much faster because you need way less data, because at every time step, you collect data about the perceptual uncertainty of the subject. And these tasks have been widely used in recent years for tracking position stimuli, starting with the work of Kate Bonn, and then they have been used to quantify eye movements towards optic flow in monkeys and humans. They've been used to measure contrast sensitivity, numerosity, and size, and to get like a dynamic picture of the contrast-induced speed bias, so these slow velocity priors as well. So how do we model these sequential tasks? Well, if you think about perception, then you can model this with the Kalman filter, for example. So this simply describes so these models describe how the structure of the world changes over time and how we get these noisy observations of the state of the world at each time step. So this is a sequential Bayesian inference problem, and for linear systems, this can be dealt with by using a Kalman filter. And the hope is that these naturalistic tasks can give us a continuous picture. Yeah, you have a question?
I was assuming in the prior task, for example, that the person would use continuous movements, or are you talking about eye tracking where it's saccades, like smooth pursuit versus saccadic eye control? Would this be more for saccadic as opposed to smooth pursuit?
So in the tracking task that I talked about by Bonner and colleagues, they used manual movements, like tracking the target with your mouse cursor. But if you do this with an eye tracking task, I assume you would have people would do both saccadic and smooth pursuit eye movements.
Right. So I'm just a little confused. Why is it sequential in that case? Say if it's continuous.
Yep.
So why is it sequential?
At each point in time, the target is at some position, and you get a noisy observation of that position, and you can integrate what you know from previous time steps about where the target is using these uncertain data points over time.
Sorry. You can use these models in a situation where you want to model each time slice to be a trial, but you can also have this to be 200 milliseconds or 20 milliseconds. So in continuous control, people use these time slices, they discretize this, right? But Dominik will show you how this actually relates to each other.
Yeah. So people are excited about this new method because instead of doing individual trials, you have like a continuous picture of how people move their hands or their eyes over time, and you collect data at each, like at a rate of 60 hertz, for example, or whatever your eye tracker allows. Okay, so the normative way of dealing with this is sequential Bayesian inference, and for linear systems this is the Kalman filter. But this is not only a perceptual task, but it's a perception and action task. So you actually have to model the whole perception-action loop. And that means there's not only uncertainty on the perceptual side, but also variability or noise on the motor side. So you have uncertainty and noise in the perceptual system and also on the motor system. So one person might just have a more jittery hand than another person. And this being a perceptual task, this also introduces costs for the actions. And these costs might be metabolic costs or biomechanical costs, but they could also be cognitive factors like motivation. Like one participant might really care about tracking the target perfectly, and another undergrad in the lab might be tired after a long day of campus and just not care about your task as much. So what's a normative way of modeling these sequential perception and action problems? You can formalize them as partially observable Markov decision processes, which is a very general framework that encompasses MDPs as special cases, but also things like multitask reinforcement learning or meta-reinforcement learning can be formalized in this fashion. And one particular special case is optimal feedback control, which has been widely used in the sensory motor control literature for things like manual reaching movements or eye movements. And if you look at the graphical model for this or the decision network for this, you again have these states that evolve over time, but now you can act on them, and your goal is to find those sequences of actions that minimize the expected cost over the whole trajectory. And one special case of these methods that has been looked at a lot in literature are these linear quadratic Gaussian control problems, where the dynamics are linear in the actions and in the states. The variability is Gaussian, and you also have a linear observation model. At each point in time, you get a linear function of the state plus some noise, and you have a quadratic cost function. And this cost function, yeah?
For the observation model, can it be multimodal, or are you talking a unimodal?
It's, in the simplest case, it's just a unimodal Gaussian, yeah. In this LQG framework, it's just a Gaussian. But you can think of extensions for this to extending to nonlinear or like other noise models. But this is just a very basic, simple version of this that has been used since the 60s. So, and you have a quadratic cost function with a term for the state costs. And this includes like task goals, like you want to track the target or you want to reach the target at some time point. And then you can have costs for the actions, and those are these intrinsic costs that I mentioned. And the solution for this LQG problem is a very simple analytical solution, because you can actually compute the estimator and the controller separately from one another, which is not the case for the general POMDP problem. And so the optimal estimator for this problem is the Kalman filter, which consists of a prediction step and a belief update step. And the optimal controller is the linear quadratic regulator. And both of these are these very simple linear equations. Yeah?
What's the difference between the tilde and the hat?
Okay, yeah, so that's a good point. The tilde is the prediction, and the hat is like the belief, the estimate. Yeah. And so if we put this in this perception and action loop, to summarize, you have this dynamical system. We, as experimenters, we control the state of the experiment. We control how the target moves, for example. And then there's this observation model that describes how the agent receives a noisy observation of the state at each time step. And then they have to do state estimation using the internal model to come up with predictions, and then feed the state estimate into the optimal control to minimize this cost function. And these IQG models, you could now ask, well, why should I care about this linear stuff from the 60s and 2022 when we have these highly nonlinear deep networks for everything? Well, I hope that Konstantin has convinced you in the keynote that it's good to have these normative models where we can accurately describe the uncertainties and costs involved in the task. And these IQG models have been used to model a variety of different sensory motor tasks. I'll show you some examples with the corresponding matrices of the dynamical systems. So here it has been applied to controlling a virtual ball. Those are the matrices of the dynamical system. Has been applied to manual reaching tasks a lot in different papers. It has been used in the neuroscience literature to model brain-machine interfaces, and also to model things like smooth pursuit or saccadic eye movement. So those are some examples where we have really accurate models of the dynamics, for example, of the hands or the eyes. Yeah?
One thing those models benefit from the trial structure is that they have a finite time controller, and I'm wondering how you handle that when it's totally continuous and it's like very long time horizon.
So the question is, because these models are usually used for these very brief movements like reaching tasks or smooth pursuit eye movements, and your question is how you can extend this to like longer time frames. Yeah, I think for the tracking task, this is quite simple, and I'll show you how it actually works out in the tracking task. But I think for like these reaching tasks, yeah, these are the examples where you have these shorter time frames. Yeah. Yeah, but in the tracking task, the control that I will show you, the controller actually is time independent because the costs and the actions and the cost for the states and the actions stay the same over the whole time horizon. So you can apply it to like longer sequences, and we'll look at this in a bit. Right. Yeah. Because for the task, it usually converges in just a couple of time steps. So what's the simplest model of the tracking task that we can come up with? Let's start with the state transition model or the dynamics model. Let's, for simplicity, just assume that we include the position of the target and the position of the cursor in this model, and we say that the position of the target is simply the previous position of the target plus some variability. And this variability is, in this tracking task, just the standard deviation of the random walk that we put into the experiment. And then the position of the cursor is the previous position of the cursor plus some control that you put into it, and then some action variability. And the observation model, and if you simulate this, you get this random walk for the target. And the observation model, we simply assume that the agent gets like an estimate, an observation of the position of the target and the position of the cursor, and we have some sensory variability or perceptual uncertainty for both of these. And if you simulate this, you get something like this, like noisy observations of the state at each point in time. Yeah?
Does Y characterize all the pixels on the screen?
No, it's not like an image computer model. It's just like a model of this two-dimensional state. Just like the position of the target is like a one-dimensional. I'm putting the one-dimensional case up here, but you can easily do it like a two-dimensional tracking task with this. Yeah. And then if we estimate the state using the Kalman filter, we get something like this. So, and this model is very simple, but it can easily be extended to include some of the more accurate models for hand movements or eye movements that are used in the literature. And now let's talk about the cost function. So for the cost function, we simply take the quadratic distance, like the quadratic difference between the target and the cursor, and we add some cost for the controls. So the C parameter trades off how important it is for me to track the target versus like minimize the actions. And you can also write this in this matrix form. And if you now act using this linear quadratic regulator control law, you get something like this, where you don't precisely track the target, but you lag behind it a little bit. And as you've already seen in the keynote, we can come up with a succession of models ranging from ideal observers to subjective actor models by changing some of the parameters of the model and or including or excluding some of these terms. And I'll show you in the code, in the notebook, how this works out. So we have a GitHub repository that includes the code for these inverse optimal control methods for the LQG systems, to simulate LQG controllers, and to come up, and we have different models for these continuous psychophysics tracking tasks, and Bayesian methods for inference for inverse optimal control, which I'll talk to you about in the second part of the tutorial. And we would really like to make this a community-driven thing, because right now we have these very simple models of tracking tasks, but we would love to extend this to other kinds of tasks, like reaching tasks, eye movement tasks, and whatever you can come up with. We would love to see issues and pull requests and have people actually use our code. And our implementation builds on JAX, which is a quite recent library that has a NumPy-like API, which I find really convenient. And it gives us some extra stuff like automatic differentiation, some smart linear algebra accelerations, and you can easily parallelize your code. And I'll show you how that works as well. So now for the first hands-on part of the tutorial, I'm going to open the Jupyter notebook, and you can also open it on Google Colab if you follow this link or scan this QR code. And then we'll walk through the steps of building a model of the tracking task and discussing the effects of some of the model parameters. And then I'll show you how to extend this to include subjective internal models as well. So let me just, I just open our GitHub page. So that everybody have the link, or should I open the thing again? Yeah, okay, good. So I'll just open this notebook in the browser by clicking on this link here. And this takes me to this Google Colab notebook, which hopefully the Wi-Fi is strong enough. Otherwise, I'll do it locally. Is it working for any of you?
Yes. I'm going to download it.
Okay, it doesn't seem to be working for me right now, so I'll just use the local version. But maybe that's fine, because it gives you some time to open up the notebook as well. Okay. Okay, I'll start by giving a very quick introduction to JAX. So first we have some code for installing the package, then we do some imports that we don't have to worry about right now, but now I'll do a quick introduction to JAX. And JAX is basically NumPy plus some extra stuff. So JAX has a NumPy-like API, which lets you define arrays like this, and then you can do some computation on these arrays and whatever. And instead of doing like the normal NumPy, I always write this JNP for JAX NumPy. You can simulate some random variables as well. You can multiply these arrays with one another and so on to do some linear algebra and stuff. And what JAX gives you on top of NumPy is, first you have automatic differentiation. So you can think of this as like a way to really do analytical gradients of your models. And so, for example, now I define this function f that just gives me the sign of x, and I can use this function grad to turn this function f into a function that computes the gradient. So the gradient of sine of pi should be the cosine, right? So let's just check the cosine of pi. Right, so this seems to work. And another thing that JAX does for you is you can easily vectorize your code. So in addition to these to this gradient computation, you can also vectorize your code. For example, if I now want to take a whole array of points, like 100 points, and I want to put it into this gradient of f, then JAX tells me that this doesn't work because the gradient is only defined for scalar terms. So I take the VMAP of this gradient function, and what I get is like an output of the whole array. So I have actually vectorized this function. So then you can, let me just plot this. So plotting works just like with any regular NumPy array. And finally, what you can do is you can compile a code so that you can efficiently run it multiple times, which we'll make use of in this notebook as well. So now we have this function that does some element-wise operations, and we want to feed this very large array into it. And by JIT compiling this code, by applying this JIT function to the function, we get a version of the function that's pre-compiled, and as you can see, in this case, it runs by like a factor of 3 faster than the original code, and we'll make use of this as well. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's look at how to model a tracking task let's look at how to model the continuous psychophysics tracking task in this linear quadratic Gaussian control framework. So we have our equations here for our linear systems, and remember I defined these matrices to model the tracking task. So I'll go ahead and create some arrays for these matrices. I define my parameters. I have some action variability. I have some perceptual uncertainty parameters for the target and for the cursor. I have a cost for the actions. And now I need to put all of these in the arrays. So the A matrix was just like the identity matrix in this case, right? The B matrix was this matrix where we say we can't control the position of the target, but we can actually control the position of the cursor. And now you can define this V matrix for the noise. And this is just the standard deviation of the random walk. And we set this to 1. And here you have the variability of the actions. And now to define our observation model, we need this C matrix and this W matrix. And the C matrix, again, is just the identity matrix because we can observe both of these variables. And this W matrix includes these perceptual uncertainties about the target and about the cursor. It's just a diagonal matrix. But you could also include correlations with this. So now to define the cost function, we set up this Q matrix in the way that computes the squared distance between these, between the target and the cursor, and we set up this A matrix just using this action cost term. Okay, so, and if we now run this, we and put all of these matrices into this LQG class that we have defined in our package, we can define our model. So let's simulate some data by applying the Kalman filter and the linear quadratic regulator, which are defined in this simulate method. And this gives us some simulated tracking data where you can see that the agent actually tracks the target with their cursor. So the target is this blue line, these blue data points that move according to the random walk, and the orange line is the cursor that tracks the target. So far, so good. Another way that we can look at these data are these cross-correlograms that we talked about, and we can also compute those. And you can see, okay, the correlation is maximal after about 25 time steps or something. And now let's look at the influence of some of the model parameters. So we define a class that inherits from this LQG class, and the class takes as inputs our parameters, our perceptual uncertainty about the target, about the cursor, the action variability, and the action cost. And we set up these matrices exactly in the same way as we did above. And then we can use this class inside a function that simulates some trajectories again and again. And to make this run efficiently, we precompile this function by using this JIT function from JAX. Now I built an interactive widget that we can use to look at the influence of these 4 model parameters. And now you can go, if you have the notebook running, you can go ahead and look at the influence of some of these parameters yourself. But to also make it fun for those who don't have their laptop open, I'll walk through some of these things. So, so here you can see, okay, the agent kind of tracks the target, but not perfectly. So let's first decrease the behavioral costs. So we get much more accurate tracking if we set the cost basically to 0. And if we now also set the action variability low, we get much smoother tracking with less variability. And this model, where you have no behavioral costs and no action variability, is basically an ideal observer model that doesn't include actions. It just gives you the estimate of the state at each point in time. But if we increase the action variability again, we see that this decreases the lag, this decreases the correlation, but doesn't really change the lag. If we now increase the behavioral costs again, we again get less accurate tracking. If we also decrease the perceptual uncertainty, we again get very accurate tracking. And if we make this perceptual uncertainty higher, we get lower correlation between target and response velocity and more time lag also. And you can also see that these 2 parameters, although the perceptual uncertainty and the behavioral costs do very similar things, so they both decrease the correlation, and they give you worse tracking performance. They don't really have the same effect. So if you have a low perceptual uncertainty and you change the behavioral costs, this doesn't really change anything about the lag, really. It just decreases the correlation. But if you leave the cost low and change the perceptual uncertainty, you get an increased lag. So there are non-trivial interactions between these parameters, even though we have this very simple linear model for the dynamics and the observation function. But in terms of the parameter space, you get highly non-linear and non-trivial interactions. Okay, so we haven't talked about this 4th parameter. This is the perceptual uncertainty about the cursor. And let's set these other variables to more reasonable values again and look at the influence of this. So if we change the perceptual uncertainty about the cursor, this doesn't really seem to do much about this cross-correlogram, but it changes, kind of introduces a bias in the trajectory. And this, the way this works, it also depends on the action. It also seems to depend on the action variability. So if you increase the action variability, then increasing the perceptual uncertainty about the cursor seems to have a much larger effect. So again, we have interactions between these parameters that we maybe wouldn't have thought about before. Yeah.
To be clear, right now you're running your model in the generative direction, right? You're constructing data.
Yeah.
Assuming that the state of the world obeys your model and that the behavioral updates also obey.
Yeah, I'm basically simulating an agent acting according to this optimal control model. Yeah.
So this would be like, maybe if your subjects, experimental subjects, were running this model in a frame, this would be behavioral data that you would.
Right, yeah. So this is just to simulate behavioral data for different values of the parameters.
Ultimately, you want to be able to infer that the A and the B and the C parameters separate.
Right, so later we'll infer these parameters from the data, but right now I just wanted to show you how these different parameters work in the tracking task. Okay, any questions so far? Yeah.
If you want to follow the code, can you tell us again how to get there? Because the timing
Sure.
just runs through GitHub, but
Yeah. Yeah, the question was if I can show the link for the code again, so I'll do that.
is this timing
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Okay. Yeah, I'm trying to pull it up.
Yeah, and this doesn't work. So this brings you to an IPython notebook within GitHub.
Yeah, and then you can click the Open and Collab button at the top of the notebook, and this takes you to the Collab notebook. And if any of these links don't work for you, you can also find them in the program. Okay. Yeah.
Could you just give a bit of intuition for why altering the perceptual uncertainty has the effect it does on the cross-correlogram?
Okay. So why the perceptual uncertainty has an effect on the cost parameter?
On the cross-correlogram.
On the
sorry.
cross-correlogram. Okay. Yeah. Sure. So if we look at, let me set these other parameters to more reasonable values again. So if we now decrease the perceptual uncertainty, we get more accurate tracking because the agent has more accurate observations of the target. So that means that they can observe the target better, and they get a more accurate belief about the position of the target, and that means that they can track it more accurately. So you get higher correlations between the velocity of the state and the velocity of the cursor. And yeah, and the cost parameter has a similar effect because if you increase the costs, you get less accurate tracking, but not because the agent cannot see the target, but instead because the agent doesn't care about tracking the target or has some biomechanical constraints that don't allow them to perfectly track the target.
But that in turn leads the model to integrate information for a longer time as well, because it seems like the cross-correlogram.
Yeah, it seems like it, but I wouldn't think of this in terms of like a perceptual integration over time, but more like an action component. So, and it's hard to disentangle these two factors just from looking at the summary statistics of the data. So I think that you really need a model of these costs and uncertainties to really, yeah, disentangle these factors. Yep.
Are you just taking the square of the control input for behavioral costs, or are you doing that?
Yeah, so the question was whether I just take the square of the control inputs for behavioral costs, and that's true. I take the square of the control inputs multiplied by this behavioral cost parameter. Yeah. Okay, any other questions about the model so far? All right, good. So what I'll do next is I'll talk about subjective internal models. So far we have assumed that this internal model that the agent is using is exactly identical to the true model of the dynamical system that we as researchers put into the task that we designed. But this doesn't necessarily have to be the case. These matrices of the dynamical system don't necessarily need to be the same because the subjects in your experiment might have limited experience with the experiment, so they might not have learned the task statistics perfectly, or they might just have some idiosyncratic assumptions, right? Because the objects in our environment are rarely on Gaussian random walks. They usually have some velocity, and it might make sense for an agent to assume that there is a velocity to the target random walk as well. So let's look at how to model this. Okay. Sorry, I'm kind of having trouble with my multiple screens. Okay, so far we have assumed that the agent perfectly knows the statistics of the target random walk, but instead of this true random walk, where we only have this standard deviation of the position random walk, we could think that the agent assumed that there's a velocity component to this random walk. So the position at the next time step is given by the position at the previous time step, plus some velocity times the time constant, plus a subjective version of this random walk standard deviation. And the velocity is given by the previous velocity plus the standard deviation of a velocity component of this random walk. So instead of looking at the behavior, let's just look at how these different random walks look when I simulate them. And if we simulate them, we get here the actual random walk on the left. Over time, you get the position of 20 different targets. And here on the right, you see the subjective version of this random walk. And if we now decrease the standard deviation of the random walk that the agent assumes, right, we just get less variable target movements. But if we now add this velocity component, we get kind of different movements of the target, but the agent might not know about this because they don't look so different. And if you only get noisy observations of this random walk anyway, then you might not be able to tell the difference between this and this. So how does this play out if we put this into our model of the agent? So I've again defined a class for this subjective actor. And now in addition to the 4 parameters that we had previously, we have these subjective versions of the standard deviation of the random walk and of this velocity standard deviation, this velocity random walk standard deviation. And now we again define some dynamical systems. So here we have the true dynamical system, which is just the same as above, our simple model of the tracking task. But for the subjective dynamical system, we come up with some different matrices. And here you have like the position of the target is given by the previous position of the target plus delta t times the velocity of the target, which is in this 3rd row of this matrix. And the velocity is just the previous velocity. And the row for the cursor position stays the same as above. And the B matrix, yeah?
Oh, sorry, I didn't want to cut you off.
It's fine. If you have a question about this point, we can. Yeah.
So Constantine had shown this really nice data where the model disagreement went considerably up. In the low contrast case, you have a suspect in terms of the weakness of this model for why that disagreement was present in the very low contrast case.
Yeah, so so the question was, in the very low contrast condition, our model didn't really fit well, especially the subjective actor model didn't accurately infer the perceptual uncertainties, and whether this has anything to do with these subjective parameters. Yeah, it just might be the case that the subjective versions of the random walk that our model has inferred fit well the behavior in the other conditions, but not in this low velocity condition, because the subjects do something else in this task once the contrast gets really low. We don't really know. Should do some more experiments, I think.
And defining a subjective actor, you have to hypothesize this belief space. So right now you're hypothesizing that the difference between the subjective perception, the subject's subjective perception, it has to do with imputing a velocity term that isn't actually govern the dynamics of the target. But I mean, there's a lot of different beliefs. The experimenter has beliefs about the subject's beliefs.
Yeah.
And this is where I'm guessing the experimenter's intuition and where hypothesis generation is happening.
Yeah.
It's not cookbook, in other words. You have to have ideas at this point.
Yeah, you have to have some ideas about what would be reasonable assumptions, but you can define a parametric model for that include different assumptions and infer from the data what you think is the most reasonable assumption about what the internal model of the agent actually was. So we'll talk about this in the second part about inverse optimal control. Okay, cool. So as we discussed, we have this true dynamical system that describes like the statistics of the task or the dynamics of the task, and then we have this subjective version where we have to define these matrices which incorporate our assumptions about the generative model that the agent uses. So we use this B matrix to incorporate our idea that the agent cannot control the target, but they control only their own position. of their cursor. And the C matrix, again, tells us that the agent thinks that they observe the position of the target and the position of the cursor, but they don't observe the velocity in this version of the model. But you could also come up with a version of the model where you get independent observations of the velocities as well. So there's like a whole playground of things that you could try out here. But let's look at how this plays out if we simulate these different assumptions and look at the behavior of these agents. So again, on the left we have the trajectories, on the right we have the cross-correlograms, and right now these subjective standard deviations of the random walk that the agent assumes are set to the true values. So we have some reasonable tracking behavior, but if we now assume that the agent thinks that the target doesn't actually move, we get no tracking at all. So the agent just tries to stay at 0 because they think the target stays at 0. But if we increase the subjective belief about this standard deviation a bit, we again get kind of accurate tracking behavior. But less accurate than if the agent actually knew the true statistics. So what about this subjective velocity standard deviation parameter? Well, if we increase this, we can get something where the agent thinks that the target has some velocity, and this leads them to overshoot the target a bit, as you can see here, and then they have to correct for that. And this can lead to these negative dips in these cross-correlograms. So you can get different behaviors just by assuming that the agent has a different generative model from the one that we put into the experiment. Okay, so let's do a kind of hands-on exercise. Oops, I don't know why this is not working, sorry. So we use this different, let's model this different experiment where the observers in this experiment were monkeys and humans, and they were tracking the focus of expansion of an optic flow field. So there's this optic flow field, and this optic flow field has a center of expansion, and this center of expansion moves according to some random walk. And in this case, the target didn't move to this basic Gaussian random walk only on the position, but instead it moved according to this Ornstein-Uhlenbeck process, which you can think of like a random walk on a damped spring that kind of tends back towards 0. So the position of the target at the next time step is just the previous position plus the velocity, and the velocity is composed of this damping term that that kind of decreases the previous velocity a bit, and this term that kind of makes the target move back towards 0 so that the center of this flow field doesn't move out of the screen during the experiment. And then you have this parameter that controls the standard deviation of this velocity random walk. So, okay, let's go back to the notebook, and let's try to implement this model in this framework. So again, I have set up a class for this model, and now we have to think about how to set up these dynamics. And because I didn't get the Colab notebook running, I have the solutions in here, which is not how this was supposed to go, but I'll just delete them and we'll come up with these ourselves. So you can follow along if you have the notebook running, but I'll do it live right now. And as you can see, live coding is never a good idea. So, okay, how do we model the position of the target? Well, we have 1 times the previous position of the target. The second element of the state is again the position of the cursor. So we set this entry to 0, and then we wanted to add this velocity component, this velocity to the random walk. So we use the third element of the state space as this velocity, and we put this velocity in here. So for the second row, which is, so this first row is just the target position, and the second row should be the cursor position. So the cursor position is just like the previous cursor position, but the target doesn't interfere with the cursor. And then the third dimension of this state space should be like the velocity, and for the velocity we had this model where we had lambda times the previous velocity and minus k times the previous state. So we put minus k in here, and 0 in here, and lambda in here, which I have to write in this weird way because lambda is a keyword in Python. And so here are the true parameters of this target motion, and we put these true parameters into the true model of the dynamics. Okay, and in this B matrix, we again incorporate our assumption that we can, the agent cannot control the position of the target. They can control the position of their own cursor, but they cannot control the velocity of the target. Okay, and in this V matrix, we again put all these variabilities. So the variability for the target position random walk is just 0. Then we have our action variability, and we have this sigma W parameter that is the standard deviation of this random walk of the velocity. And again, we can, now we have the true dynamical system of the target motion and the motion of the response set up. And we can now come up with a subjective version of this. So for the subjective matrices, we use basically the same dynamics, but instead of using the true values of these parameters, we use these subjective versions that are again given as parameters that are given to this class, okay? So if we now run this, we can, again, simulate some behavior and these different parameters.
I didn't finish typing that code.
Oh, okay, yeah, sure. I'll just show the code. So while some people are finishing typing the code, maybe this would be a good time for some questions. All right, all set. So then we'll run this, and again, do the simulation. And again, we can simulate some tracking behavior, and depending on how we choose these subjective versions of the, that the agent assumes about this random walk, we can get wildly different behaviors out of the model. So for example, if I turn this parameter all the way up, I again get no tracking at all. Yep.
Sorry, could you just scroll up to W again? I missed W and it's not filled in the thing.
Yeah, so
Thanks.
W is again this matrix
Yeah,
that includes
thank
like these observation uncertainty terms, and you have your perceptual uncertainty about the position of the target and the perceptual uncertainty about the position of the cursor, which in this case is just about the position of where your eye is looking on the screen.
Thanks.
And you could also have subjective versions of these parameters as well. Like we usually assume that people know the uncertainties of their visual system really well, but this also would allow you to build a version of the model where you could have a different version of the true measurement distribution that governs the observation model of the agent and their assumed observation model. Okay, so if we look at this, we can again simulate very different behaviors depending on how we choose these parameters. So if I turn this lambda parameter all the way up, we get some oscillations in these cross-correlograms. If I turn this all the way down, we get less accurate tracking. If I change this, this doesn't seem to change much about the behavior. Oh, it does. So again, and here you have like all the freedom to incorporate all the different assumptions that you could have about the internal model of the agent.
I think a number of us are having the same problem. Can you just go back and show us the first two lines again?
Yeah, sure. So this part? What about it?
I'm getting an error. The last line of A, but it looks identical to what you typed before.
Maybe you forgot the comma after this line? Or,
Oh, yeah, okay. I just missing something. Thanks.
got it?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry? Uh, yeah, the subjective values, I named them K subjective and lambda subjective in this case, and sigma W subjective. Okay, sorry. Okay, so once we have this, we can look at these different behaviors, and yeah, okay.
Case subjective again, please.
Yeah, sure. So it's just the same as this true version of A, but instead of like the true parameters, you use these subjective versions. Sorry, I didn't quite hear this. Can you maybe use the microphone?
Oh boy. When I change K, lambda, and W, the trajectory itself doesn't change very much, but it seems like the cross correlogram changes more. Is that why you have like two measures of it?
Yeah, I mean, so the trajectory itself is just here one trajectory of one trial to illustrate the behavior, but this can obviously vary over trials because we have different uncertainties in each trial. Or different noisy versions of the stimulus in each trial. So the cross-correlogram can change because like you have different behavior on average. Like so this is like an average over like multiple trials, or this is just a single trial. Okay. I think maybe that's the reason why you're seeing these differences.
Yeah, I'm just trying to wrap my head around like if like when you change values over a big range, you're still seeing trajectories changing only minutely, and so it's like maybe what matters.
So,
is,
which parameter are you changing?
I was changing all of them together, so
Okay.
that's probably not helpful. If like, see for example, lambda, like it's mostly the cross-correlogram changes, which is maybe the point, but I was just trying to understand why trajectories don't really change that much.
I mean, there are some changes in the trajectory as well when you change this sigma W parameter, but they are kind of more subtle, right? But if you turn this all the way down, the trajectory also changes, right? Yeah. Yeah. I mean, these cross-correlograms give you like a more subtle picture than looking at the trajectories themselves, because here you have an analysis of the velocities of the target and the velocity of the gaze in this case. So you see more fine-grained changes than if you were to look at the positions only. Yeah. Okay. Any more questions about simulating these different subjective actor models, bounded actor models using our code? Okay, if that's not the case, then I'll go to the second part.
Just a quick question.
Yep.
So have the same trajectory as you have. This is like, can it have with different runs, different trajectories? This is some stochastic process.
So the question was whether the trajectories can change over different runs of the model. Yeah, because we have all these stochasticities in there. You have noise in the dynamics, you have noise in the observation function, so each trajectory that you simulate from the model is different. I just chose like one random seed for all of these different parameter values so that we can actually see how the trajectory changes. Okay. Okay, now for the second part of the tutorial about inverse optimal control. So in the first part of the tutorial, I talked a lot about normative models, so Bayesian decision making, how should we act given our beliefs and costs, and we extended this to this sequential decision making case where we have actions over an extended amount of time, and formulated this as a partially observable Markov decision process and optimal feedback control. And while these normative models have been very successful in different areas of cognitive science, like ideal observer models in perception, Bayesian models of perception and decision making in general, and optimal feedback control in sensory motor tasks, in other disciplines like behavioral economics, it is clear that the behavior does not always conform to the normative theory. Whereas in perceptual domains, the Bayesian models are very popular to this day. But even in perception, these normative models do not always predict behavior perfectly. So there's this BBS paper by Ranev and Dennison in 2018 that describes all these deviations from the normative theory, where you have sequential effects, for example. So even though the individual trials are independent of one another, we see all these correlations between choices on subsequent trials. We see suboptimal adjustments to changes in payoffs or prior probabilities that shouldn't be there according to a normative model. And there's a mismatch between different tasks with the same stimulus as well. So if you do a two alternative forced choice task with this Gaussian blob stimulus that I showed you, and then you do a yes-no task or a two interval forced choice task where you don't do it spatially, but instead you do it temporally, you can get different measurements of the perceptual uncertainty from these different tasks, even though they should be the same according to the normative theory. And then there's also sub-optimalities in Q combination. So what do we usually do as Bayesian modelers if we observe these deviations from the normative theory? And I kind of like this table in this paper where they say, well, if our predictions don't quite align with the theory, we kind of tweak the likelihood function a little bit. So we assume that the agent has some wrong assumptions about the generative model, or there are some capacity limitations in the likelihood function, or we assume that the agent kind of had a different prior than we put into the experiment, or that they had some subjective cost function. And this is perfectly in line with how John Anderson described how we proceed in coming up with rational models. So this goes like this. So we specify the goals of the cognitive system, then we develop a formal model of the environment to which the system is adapted, so like our priors. Then we make the minimal assumptions about the computational limitations. For example, we assume that they act according to optimal control, but maybe with some costs for the computations or whatever. And then we derive the optimal behavioral function given 1 and 3 above. So we derive the optimal control law and simulate some actors like we did in the first part of the tutorial. And then we examine the literature to see whether the predictions of the behavioral function are confirmed. So we simulate actors with different parameters to kind of predict how the behavior changes according to changes in contrast of the stimulus, and see whether this lines up with the literature. And then we repeat and iteratively refine our theory. But it's rarely clear a priori what the goals of the cognitive system actually are, because you can have idiosyncratic preferences or subjective internal costs, and we rarely know what the system's model of the environment is. They might have some wrong assumptions about the statistics of the task. They might not be perfectly attuned to the experiment, to the statistics of the experiment, and you don't always know what the computational limitations of your agents are. And this is also aligned with what critics of the Bayesian approach have been talking about. For example, in this paper on Bayesian fundamentalism, where I think this Bayesian fundamentalist is a bit of a strawman figure, but I really like the point that they are making in the discussion section, where they say that there are generally many Bayesian models of any task corresponding to different assumptions about the learner's goals and model of the environment. And a comparison among alternative models would potentially reveal a great deal about what people's goals and mental models actually are. So wouldn't it be nice if we could automate this process of comparing different models a little bit? And so this is where inverse normative modeling comes in, where we take this procedure that was specified by Anderson, but instead of defining one model, we define a whole parametric family of models that describe the goals, the internal model, and the computational limitations of the cognitive system. And then we do the whole thing of deriving the optimal behavioral function. But then instead of just comparing it to observed behavior, we actually fit the model to observed behavior using statistical methods. And then we still need to repeat and iteratively refine our theory. Maybe we have chosen the wrong class of models, and so on and so forth. So the way I view this, while normative models ask why the behavior is the way it is on the computational level, and makes assumptions about the task and derives the optimal solution, descriptive models simply describe the relationships between stimuli and behavior, and they are usually fit to the data using statistical methods. So in inverse normative modeling, we can reconcile these descriptive and normative approaches by fitting these normative models to the data to find out what the assumptions of the actor actually are. And so to come back to this idea of different tasks, in single trial tasks, this has been used a lot. So for example, you can already think of, why is this so small? You can already think of signal detection theory as an application of this, right? You can think of the criterion as a combination of priors and costs, and of the sensitivity as the perceptual uncertainty. But this is not like you as a researcher don't know a priori what these are, but you infer this from the data using signal detection theory. So this is like an early example of inverse normative models already. Okay, somehow my slides are messed up, sorry. Then you have, this is like the famous Kurting and Wolpert paper, where you infer the cost function. It is. Where you infer the cost function from behavior in an estimation task. Then you have this Stocker and Simoncelli paper on inferring priors from behavior in this speed discrimination task. And then we have this very general framework by Luigi Acerbi, where you have the internal model of the agent, as described as a Bayesian decision-making model, and then you invert this model by coming up with the generative model of behavior. And then we have more recent work that by Sohn and Yazayeri, which builds on the fact that you can get different combinations of priors and costs that lead to the same behavior, but you can disentangle actually which representation people are using by looking at their learning. And in sequential tasks, these ideas have also been applied. So this is work by Baker and colleagues on a Bayesian theory of mind, where they formalized the decision-making of a rational actor as a reinforcement learning agent acting in an MDP, and then they invert the model using Bayesian statistics. Then you have the paper by my advisor is obviously the only one where the image works. This was not planned. So you can use modular reinforcement learning to figure out which different task goals here, like avoiding obstacles or picking up objects while you navigate or walking towards a target, which of these goals are more important to the agent. And then you have work in the neuroscience literature, inferring the internal models from neural activity in a brain-machine interface. And you have very recent work from Zach Pitko's lab on inverse normative model, inverse rational control, as they call it, where you also assume that the agent acts according to a POMDP model, and then you infer from the behavior what their internal model and their costs are. And so how does this inverse optimal control approach work? So we assume that the agent has an internal model and it has some uncertainty about the objects in the environment, and they have some goals and some costs. And we as researchers come up with a statistical model of the behavior, and we have uncertainty about these parameters of the internal model of the agent, and we want to infer from the behavior what these uncertainties, goals, and costs in internal models are. So applied to this POMDP and optimal control framework that we talked about, we assume that the internal model of the agent is this POMDP model with states, actions, rewards, and observations. And we, as researchers, invert this model. So we don't observe all the stuff that's internal to the agent, but we do observe their behavior. So we observe the true state of the world because we control the experiment. And the agent's model has some parameters. For example, in the continuous psychophysics tracking task, these parameters include the perceptual uncertainties, action variabilities, costs, internal model parameters, and so on. And our goal is to infer these parameters from the data. So what we are after is the posterior probability of these parameters given the observed behavior. And we can get at this by doing Bayesian modeling. So from the perspective of the agent, we did a Bayesian model, and then from the perspective of the researcher, we can again be Bayesian in reasoning about what the parameters of the agent's internal model are. And to do this, in this case, we have a problem. So this likelihood function is very hard to compute because each state depends on all the previous states through all of these variables that we don't measure because they are internal to the agent. So this is a very hard inference problem because we don't have like a Markov system here because each state depends on all previous states. And so how do we deal with this? We use two main tricks in this case. So first, we can do belief tracking. So we need a summary statistic of the agent's belief given all of the past behavior that we have observed so far. We compute a summary of what we know about the agent's belief given all of the previous states. And the second trick is that you can realize that the joint system of states and belief is actually Markovian. And this is an idea that I got from this cool robotics paper by Van den Berg et al. So you can see that the joint dynamical system of these states and these internal estimates is actually Markovian, so they only depend on the previous state and the previous estimate. So I used these two insights to come up with an algorithm for inverse optimal control in a probabilistic setting. So this algorithm helps us compute the likelihood function by iterating through these three steps. So we propagate our uncertainty about the agent's belief using this belief tracking distribution through the joint dynamical system of the states and estimates to come up with this joint distribution of the next state and the next estimate given all of the previous states that we observed so far. And the second step is that we can marginalize out, once we have this distribution, we marginalize out the agent's belief, and this gets us the contribution to the likelihood function at this particular time step. So this is like the distribution of the next state given all of the previous states that we have observed so far. And the third step is that we condition on the observed state to arrive at this distribution over the next estimate given all of the behavior we have observed so far. So this is our belief tracking distribution for the next time step that we can then again use in this first step of the algorithm. And so this is a very general way of thinking about probabilistic inverse optimal control. But for linear Gaussian system, all these steps of marginalizing and conditioning are actually very easy to do because for a linear Gaussian system, we can just write this joint system of states and estimates again as a linear Gaussian system, and then we can do all of these operations in closed form. So we can propagate the uncertainty about the agent's belief, marginalize out the agent's belief, and condition on the observed state all in closed form. So we simply insert the Kalman filter and the LQR control law to get this joint system of states and estimates. And
So when you don't have that advantage that you're of a linear Gaussian system, you're going to talk about what to do in this case.
yeah, I mean,
Particle filters or what have you.
yeah, you can do some extensions to do these steps efficiently, and I'll talk about some of these options later. Yeah. So, but this is why we use this very well-known LQG model to derive this inverse optimal control method, because this is one case where you can actually solve it kind of analytically, and then, yeah, we'll talk about the extensions later. So now for the implementation. So our implementation is based on NumPyro, which is a probabilistic programming library that builds on JAX. and it includes inference algorithm using gradient-based Markov chain Monte Carlo methods like the NUTS algorithm, and it makes use of all of these awesome optimizations that JAX has, like these linear algebra accelerations and automatic differentiation. So now for the second part of the code examples. So here I have again written this approach for the likelihood function, but now we look at how this actually works in the code. So let's go ahead and again define some true parameters from which we simulate some synthetic data. So let's define the position, the perceptual uncertainty of the target, action variability, costs, and so on. And then we simulate some data from our bounded actor model, and we get a trajectory X. In this case, we simulate 50 trials and 500 time steps. And then we can compute the log likelihood of the parameters. In this case, let's first look at one of the parameters, the perceptual uncertainty, while keeping all of the other parameters constant at the true value, just to illustrate. And to do that, we have a method on this on our LQG class that simply computes the log likelihood according to this probabilistic inverse optimal control algorithm that I just showed you. And if we now do that, and again use some of these awesome things that we have in JAX, like vectorizing the computation of the log likelihood to compute it for a whole array of points of this parameter, then we can get our log likelihood function, and we can see that the maximum of this log likelihood function is roughly at the position of the true parameter value. And we can now just do gradient-based optimization of the log likelihood, because we can actually compute the gradients because we have implemented everything in JAX. So you could use your favorite gradient-based optimizer and just do gradient descent on the log likelihood. But we want to be good Bayesians, right? So we do the whole Bayesian thing, and for that we use NumPyro, which is, lets us define these probabilistic models by using numpyro.sample for all of these random variables. So here we have our prior distributions over the 4 parameters of our bounded actor model, and since all of these variables except for the cost can be interpreted in terms of like units on the screen where you perform the experiment, you can actually choose the prior distributions in a reasonable way depending on your experiment. And then we pass these parameters to the model and compute the likelihood by simply computing this conditional distribution of the data given, of the observed data, and we pass the data as observations into this likelihood. And then we can actually run this. And so this takes a couple of minutes, but for a problem like this, where we have like 500 time steps and maybe 50 trials, it should only take us like 5 or 6 minutes. Yeah, I don't have much time, so I'm not going to let it run for that long. But yeah, so and then we can look at these posterior distributions that we infer using this method, and you can see that in this case the action variability was accurately inferred. So this is like a pair plot of all of these 4 parameters of the model. So this is action variability and action cost, and you can see that both of these are accurately inferred. Then you have perceptual uncertainty about the cursor and action cost, and they are also accurately inferred. So in this case, we were lucky and we got nice posterior distributions. And so what can we do with these posterior distributions now? So what we can do is we can also do belief tracking. So once we have this posterior distribution of the model, we can, for example, take the posterior mean, and then for new data, we can track the belief of the agent by doing this belief tracking thing that I told you about. And if we now, so we have also a function that once you have a model with some parameters, you can compute the distribution of the agent's belief. So this is now our uncertainty about the agent's uncertainty. Let me show you how this looks. So here we have, again, the target that moves on this random walk, and we have a distribution over the belief of the target. So this is our uncertainty about what we think the belief of the agent was at each time step. And we can see that this varies wildly because the beliefs are variable, and we can only track it with some uncertainty. And this uncertainty depends on the perceptual uncertainty and on the motor variability and so on. And we can also infer the belief about the cursor position that the agent has. And so instead of only looking at these summary statistics of the data, we can also look at the summary statistics of these beliefs that we inferred. Yeah. Question?
Hi, yeah, this is awesome. Can you speak a little bit about the benefits of putting your likelihood function in the domain of states instead of the domain of actions? Like, why try and predict the state that's going to happen instead of the action inputs?
Yeah, so in our framework, we assume that the intended action is not actually observable. We assume that the intended action is just like a motor signal that goes from your brain to your muscles. And so we can't actually observe this if we don't have neural recordings. We only observe the behavior in terms of like the tracking data that we get. So, but you could also come up with a way, if you actually have observations of the actions, if you have like a discrete system, you could come up with an algorithm that uses these actions as observations as well. And I think this is what what happens in this paper by Pitkoff's group that is published in PNAS, but I'm not quite sure about the algorithm. Yeah. Yeah.
Getting back to the tilde versus the hat.
Yeah.
So the subject's belief is X hat.
Yeah, so this is now the X hat, so the subject's belief. We could also compute the X tildes because those are just functions of the observations and of the actions. So, yeah.
Are you making a distinction between the subject's belief about the state and the subject's estimate of the state? Are those two different things?
So the way I'm using these terms, I use belief and estimate interchangeably. But in this case, I mean the belief is like a Gaussian belief, and so the estimate is like the mean of this Gaussian. And you could also look at the variability, like the standard deviation of this Gaussian. So then the belief would be like the mean and the variance. Yeah. Yeah.
Second question, I was wondering what the variability is. Is this like a filtered variability or smooth variability?
So the question was whether this variability is a filtered variability or a smooth variability. So these faint green lines that I put in here, so these are just samples from this belief distribution. Yeah, you could do a smooth version by just plotting like the standard deviation or whatever. Okay, any other questions? Good. How are we doing time-wise? Because we started a little bit late. And 10 minutes? Okay, yeah. Okay, so I'll do a couple more minutes, and then we can all have lunch. Okay, so like I said, we can do belief tracking. So we quantify our uncertainty about the agent's belief. And what would be really cool is to correlate these beliefs with neural recordings, because you get something extra, right? You don't only have the inputs like the stimuli and the behavior, so the outputs, but you also get the beliefs. And I would be really interested in talking to people who have neural recordings in these tasks and figuring out how to relate these uncertainties and costs and beliefs that we infer using our methods to these neural data. So let's talk about some of the limitations of this LQG control approach. What I like about this is that it's so modest and transparent, because the limitations are right there in the name. So it's linear, it's quadratic, it's Gaussian. And so let's talk about this Gaussian assumption first. So one thing that we know about the motor system and about our sensory system is that there's signal-dependent noise. So there are these well-known studies in motor control that show that signal-dependent noise is actually important to explain some of the phenomena that we observe in these reaching tasks and eye movement tasks and so on. So these bell-shaped velocity profiles and speed accuracy trade-offs, and this observation that we don't control the variability in the directions that don't matter for the task in this paper by Tudorov and Jordan. All of these predictions arise from signal-dependent noise in optimal control models. So Tudorov extended this LQG model to account for signal-dependent noise. So we have action-dependent noise in the dynamics, and we have state-dependent noise in the observation model to account for Weber-Fechner phenomena. And these optimal control models with signal-dependent noise have been widely used in the sensory motor control literature to model things like motor adaptation, active sensing with state-dependent sensory feedback, saccadic suppression, and task-dependent changes in behavior depending on the cost function. So again, just to motivate inverse optimal control, all of these models have many free parameters, and these values are usually informed by like empirical or theoretical knowledge about the uncertainties in the system. But some of these other parameters, like these cost parameters, must be tuned by hand. And one thing you can do is you can do a sensitivity analysis. So you sample lots of different values for the parameters and look at how the trajectories change depending on that. And here you can see that you get qualitatively quite similar behavior for very different values of the parameter, but not quantitatively similar behavior. So it would be cool to actually fit these models to the data. So we extended this inverse optimal control approach to the signal-dependent noise optimal control model by Tudorov. And Matthias helped me extend these equations for the LQG case to the signal-dependent noise model. And so we evaluate this model on some simulated reaching data, and we can show that we can accurately infer these parameter values, and including these signal-dependent noises actually matter for the inverse optimal control as well, because if you don't include the signal-dependent noise terms, you get way worse parameter estimates. And then we can, again, use this model to do belief tracking. If we only have noisy observations of the position of the subject's hand, we can also infer their belief about this position and the belief about their velocity and acceleration. We applied these to some monkey reaching data that were freely available online. We applied this also to this saccadic eye movement model and to randomly generated problems to evaluate that it works on a wide range of different tasks. So to summarize, these continuous psychophysics tasks are a step towards natural behavior, but they still allow us to maintain experimental control over the statistics of the task and the uncertainties and goals. And Bayesian inference and decision-making can be used as a normative framework for thinking about sequential behavior in these tasks. And inverse optimal control helps us reconcile the normative and descriptive models for these tasks by inferring the beliefs and goals from the observed data. So with that, I want to thank all the members of the Rotkopf Lab in Darmstadt, and I want to thank you for your attention. And yeah, if there are any more questions, I'm happy to answer them.
If there are questions from the audience, we can take them now. Yeah.
I was wondering about the numerical stability of the algorithm, and is it dependent on the state size and things like that? And how big of state size have you tried?
So I mostly use this algorithm for up to 5 dimensions of the state space, and there I didn't encounter much issues with numerical stability, but yeah, it should be worth checking.
Just out of curiosity, what are the what's the time commitment for doing these kinds of analyses? I mean, earlier you said you could run an analysis in 5 minutes. I don't know if that was simulated data or.
Yeah, there was inference on some simulated data.
Okay.
And there it takes like a couple of minutes for like one simulated data set. And if you actually do it on like a real data set where you have multiple conditions, these models can take a couple of hours to run, which is reasonable for Bayesian models of complex behavior. But if you would do something like maximum likelihood or variational inference, you could probably make it quite a bit quicker.
Sorry, this is super cool. The generalization to the adapted to the noise properties of the motor system is really cool for inverse LQG. Have you done it for the full iterative LQR model?
We're working on that.
That's gonna be a hard problem. Yeah, that's really cool. Is it fast?
So for the signal-dependent noise model, you can do maximum likelihood just in like less than a minute for simulated data. So it's quite efficient, I think. Due to this analytical version of the likelihood, we do some approximations to deal with the signal-dependent noise, but we show in our Neuroscience paper that these approximations are not too bad. So yeah.
That's a huge achievement. Great work.
Thank you.
Yeah, hi, thank you very much for the tutorial. And I was essentially wanting to ask what kind of things we would actually have to do if we wanted to use some other model effectively, because you've hidden a bit what the complicated part in the background. So if we had some other task where we have some model of this kind, what kind of steps would we actually have to implement in the background such that the log likelihood stuff will work out?
Yeah, so right now we mostly have like a zoo of different tracking task models in our repository, but I would love to make this like a community-driven project where people can contribute their own models, and we would need to figure out along the way the hurdles in getting there. But if your model can be formulated within the LQG framework, it should be very easy to integrate it in the code, and the code is freely available on GitHub, so you can just open an issue for any problems that you encounter and trying to set up your own models, and then we can think together about how to fix them. So right now we only have like these time-independent matrices, but it should be like an afternoon's work for extending it to like time-dependent problems or whatever.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, yeah, let's thank Dominik one more time. That was amazing. Thank you.
Thank you so much.